Dear friends, after a tiring day, welcome to Mysterious Sleep Stories, where the boundaries between history and mystery blur like the morning mist over ancient mountains. Tonight, we invite you to settle into your most comfortable spot. Let the weight of the day drift away like leaves on a gentle stream, and embark on a journey to Imperial China, where duty and destiny intertwine in ways that defy the mundane flow of time. Tonight's story takes us back over 1,300 years to the glorious Tang Dynasty, a golden age of art, poetry, and administrative refinement, encompassing the vast lands we call China today. But this is not a story of emperors residing in jade palaces or scholars writing poetry under cherry blossoms. Instead, we follow the tale of a humble imperial courier whose name has been whispered in village tales for generations, whose final journey turned into something far stranger than any official record could ever contain. This is the story of Zhang and the mountain where time itself chose to pause. Section 1. The Imperial Courier System, Historical Foundation. To understand our courier's journey, we must first understand the remarkable network that employed him, a system so sophisticated it would not be matched in efficiency for centuries to come. The Tang Dynasty, ruling from 618 to 907, created an empire that stretched from the Korean peninsula to the edges of Persia, a realm so vast that maintaining communication across it required nothing short of genius in organization and execution. The imperial postal system, known as the or courier stations, formed the nervous system of this great empire. Picture, if you will, a web of roads and waterways connecting every corner of the realm, punctuated at regular intervals by stations where fresh horses waited, where tired messengers could find brief respite, where the flow of information never ceased. These weren't simple rest stops. They were sophisticated installations, each staffed with personnel who understood the gravity of their role in maintaining the empire's cohesion. During the height of the Tang Dynasty, there were over 1,600 of these postal stations spread across the empire. Some were grand establishments in major cities, with multiple courtyards, stables for dozens of horses, and sleeping quarters for traveling officials. Others were lonely outposts in mountain passes or desert edges, manned by a handful of dedicated souls whose duty it was to keep the imperial communication flowing, no matter the weather, no matter the danger. The distances between these stations were carefully calculated. On major routes, they might be spaced 30 or 40 li apart, roughly 10 to 15 miles in modern measurements. This distance represented a careful balance. It had to be far enough to make efficient use of each courier's endurance and each horse's stamina, yet close enough that a messenger pushing hard could reach the next station before complete exhaustion. In more remote or treacherous regions, the stations might be closer together, sometimes separated by only 10 li, acknowledging the toll that difficult terrain took on both rider and mount. The couriers themselves came from varied backgrounds, but all shared certain qualities. They had to be men of exceptional endurance and reliability. The training was rigorous, not just in horsemanship and navigation, but in the protocols that governed the handling of imperial documents. A courier needed to know, at a glance, the level of urgency attached to any dispatch. The most routine administrative correspondence might travel at a leisurely pace, perhaps covering 150 li in a day. But urgent military intelligence or imperial decrees could demand speeds that seemed almost superhuman, sometimes requiring couriers to cover 500 or even 600 li in a single day. Such speeds came at a cost, of course. Imagine the reality of such a journey. A courier would begin his shift in the cold darkness before dawn, mounting a fresh horse while the previous rider staggered to a bed, too exhausted to even remove his boots. The road stretched ahead, sometimes through cultivated lands where farmers were just beginning their day's work, sometimes through wilderness where bandits might lurk in the shadows of ancient trees. The courier's equipment was strictly regulated. He wore a leather belt with bells attached, their jingling announcing his approach and demanding right of way. In one hand, he gripped the reins. In the other, a bamboo tube sealed with wax and bearing the Imperial seal, its contents potentially containing orders that could save armies, doom criminals, or alter the course of provinces. The life expectancy of an Imperial courier was not particularly long. The constant physical strain took its toll. Bones broke from falls at high speed. Exhaustion led to errors in judgment that could prove fatal in mountain passes or river crossings. Bandits, despite the severe penalties for interfering with Imperial communications, still sometimes dare to attack isolated couriers, drawn by rumors of valuable cargo, or simply by the opportunity to strike at the Empire's infrastructure. Disease, too, was an ever-present threat. A courier might carry messages through a region struck by plague, and while he pushed through with a dispatch, he could not outrun the illness he'd been exposed to. Yet for all these hardships, there was honor in the profession. A courier served the emperor directly, in a very real sense. The documents he carried might come from the Son of Heaven himself. The speed and reliability with which he delivered them could influence the fate of thousands. Families took pride when one of their sons entered the courier service. It meant he had passed rigorous tests of character and capability. It meant he possessed something special, a combination of physical prowess, mental fortitude, and unwavering dedication. The stations themselves were small worlds unto themselves. The larger ones housed not just couriers and their horses, but also officials who inspected documents, scribes who recorded the passage of messengers, blacksmiths who shod horses, and cooks who prepared the simple but nourishing meals that kept the couriers going. There are strict regulations about how quickly a courier should be provided with a fresh mount, how the condition of horses should be maintained, how the quality of roads should be monitored and reported. At night, these stations buzzed with a particular kind of energy. Couriers coming from opposite directions might briefly overlap, exchanging news from the regions they'd passed through before collapsing into sleep. The stable hands worked by lamplight, checking hooves and saddles, preparing for the next wave of departures that would come before dawn. The station masters maintained meticulous records, knowing that any discrepancy could lead to severe punishment. Everything that moved through the imperial postal system had to be accounted for. Every hour of delay had to be justified. Every horse's condition had to be noted. The waterway routes were equally impressive. The Tang Dynasty had inherited and expanded upon earlier canal systems, creating an inland water network that rivaled the road system in importance. Boats specially designed for courier service plied these waters, their crews trained to maintain steady speeds day and night. These vessels could carry larger and heavier cargoes than horses, making them ideal for transporting official documents in bulk, tribute from distant provinces, or urgent supplies needed by military forces. The couriers who worked these water routes faced different challenges than their counterparts on horseback. River currents could be treacherous, changing with the seasons and the weather. Navigating through narrow gorges required skill and nerve. Pirates operated on some waterways, organized bands that could overwhelm a courier boat if it wasn't properly guarded. Yet the water routes also offered advantages. A boat moving with a strong current could cover immense distances with less physical strain on its crew than a hard-riding horseman endured. The waterborne couriers developed their own culture, their own traditions, their own pride in their particular branch of the imperial service. Winter brought its own set of challenges to the entire courier network. In the north, snow could bury roads, making passage treacherous or impossible. Rivers froze, disrupting the water routes. Yet the system was designed with redundancy. Alternative routes existed for most major corridors of communication. Stations stocked extra supplies against the possibility of being cut off for days or even weeks. Special equipment was maintained for winter travel, including sleds that could be drawn by horses or dogs when wheels became useless. The compensation for couriers varied based on their rank and the difficulty of their assignments. A courier working a dangerous or particularly demanding route might receive extra pay, along with certain privileges. Families of couriers who died in service received pensions, an unusual benefit for the time and one that reflected the value the empire placed on maintaining a reliable pool of potential recruits. Some couriers, after years of faithful service, were promoted to administrative positions within the postal system, becoming station masters or inspectors, their knowledge of the routes and the work proving invaluable. But beyond the practical details, beyond the regulations and the logistics, there was something almost mystical about the courier system. It represented the empire's will made manifest in physical form. A single man on a horse, carrying a tube of bamboo, embodied the power and reach of the emperor himself. The sound of hoofbeats in the night, the jingle of bells approaching an isolated mountain station. These were sounds that connected the furthest reaches of civilization to its beating heart in the capital of Chang'an. The couriers themselves understood this. They knew they were not merely delivering messages. They were maintaining the threads that bound the empire together. In their saddlebags rode peace or war, justice or mercy, prosperity or ruin for those who would read the messages they carried. This knowledge gave even the most junior courier a sense of purpose that transcended the hardship and danger of the work. It's against this backdrop that we must understand Zhang Wei. He was a product of this system, shaped by its demands, elevated by its trust, and ultimately consumed by its relentless logic. The system needed men willing to push beyond ordinary limits, to venture into dangerous and remote regions, to complete their missions regardless of personal cost. Zhang Wei was exactly such a man. The protocols that governed urgent dispatches were particularly strict. When a document was marked with certain seals, indicating military urgency or imperial command, it triggered a chain reaction along the courier routes. Station masters were authorized to commandeer civilian horses if necessary. Local officials were required to provide any assistance the courier might need. Guards could be assigned to accompany particularly important or dangerous deliveries. And the courier himself was invested with temporary authority that transcended his humble social station. He spoke with the emperor's voice, in a sense, and interference with his passage was treated as treason. This system, sophisticated as it was, still depended on human judgment in countless small moments. A courier had to decide whether to push on through worsening weather or to wait at a station for conditions to improve. He had to assess the condition of his mount, knowing whether the horse could make it to the next station or would collapse halfway there. He had to navigate not just geographical terrain, but also the complex social landscape of the empire, knowing when to invoke his authority and when discretion was the better course. The mountains presented special challenges. China's landscape is dominated by dramatic mountain ranges, and many critical routes passed through high-altitude terrain. The air grew thin up there. Storms could appear with terrifying suddenness. Passes that were clear in summer became deadly traps in winter. Avalanches, rock slides, and flash floods could erase sections of road without warning. Yet these mountain routes were often the most direct paths between important regions, and so they had to be maintained and traveled regardless of the danger. It was in these mountains that the courier system faced its greatest test and its most profound mysteries. The official records speak of couriers who departed into mountain passes and simply never emerged. Searches would be mounted, but sometimes no trace of the missing man would be found, no body, no horse, no sign of what befell him. The mountains, it seemed, claimed their own. Local people who lived near these treacherous passes developed their own folklore about what happened in the heights. They spoke of mountain spirits, of hidden valleys where time flowed differently, of ancient powers that predated the empire and cared nothing for its affairs. The couriers, practical men focused on their duties, generally dismissed such tales. But even the most skeptical might feel a chill riding through certain passes, might sense something watching from the peaks above, might notice how sounds seem to behave strangely in particular locations. The station masters in mountain regions were often chosen from local populations, men who knew the terrain and its moods. They could read the signs that warned of coming storms. They understood which passes were safe at which times of year. They kept track of the seasons, the migrations of birds, the behavior of wild animals, all of which could provide crucial information to a courier planning a mountain crossing. These station masters became repositories of practical wisdom, and the smart courier listened carefully to their advice. Yet sometimes duty demanded that a courier ignore such advice. An urgent dispatch couldn't wait for ideal weather. Strategic military movements couldn't be delayed because a pass was dangerous. And so men rode into conditions that local wisdom said were foolhardy, trusting in their training, their horses, and perhaps in the protection that came from serving the emperor's will. This, then, was the world that shaped Zhang Wei. A world of duty and danger, of strict protocols and impossible demands, of honor and sacrifice. It was a world where the individual mattered less than the message he carried, where personal survival was secondary to the completion of the mission. Understanding this world, understanding the forces that molded men like Zhang Wei, is essential to understanding what happened to him in the mountains. For our courier was about to embark on a journey that would test not just his endurance or his loyalty, but the very nature of reality as he understood it. He would carry an imperial dispatch into a mountain pass, and what he found that would defy every practical lesson he'd ever learned, would challenge every assumption about the way the world worked. His story would become legend, whispered in the very stations he once passed through, a tale that grew with each telling, yet never quite captured the full strangeness of what occurred. Section 2. Mountains in Chinese Mythology. Before we follow Zhang Wei into his fateful journey, we must understand what the mountains meant to the people of his time. The Chinese relationship with mountains extends back into the mists of prehistory, reaching beyond written records into the realm of pure mythology. Mountains were not merely geographical features. They were access points connecting heaven and earth, dwelling places of immortals and spirits, gateways to other realms of existence. The most sacred of all mythological mountains was Kunlun, described in ancient texts as rising at the very center of the world. According to the mythology recorded in texts like the classic of Mountains and Seas, Kunlun was impossibly vast and tall, its peak reaching into the heavens themselves. This was no ordinary mountain. It was said to be surrounded by a river of weak water, so called because it couldn't support even the weight of a feather. Fire mountains ringed its outer approaches, their flames consuming any unauthorized visitor. But for those who somehow managed to pass these barriers, Kunlun revealed itself as a paradise beyond imagining. The paradise of Kunlun was described in breathtaking detail by ancient writers. Jade palaces rose in terraces up the mountainside, their architecture defying earthly limitations. Gardens grew with plants that conferred immortality or granted miraculous powers. Springs flowed with water that could heal any disease or restore youth to the aged. The air itself was said to be infused with vital energy, so pure that breathing it could extend one's lifespan. And presiding over this realm was the Queen Mother of the West, a being of such power and majesty that even the gods themselves paid her homage. The Queen Mother of the West, known as Wangmu, was one of the most important deities in Chinese mythology. In the earliest texts, she was described as having both human and animal features, fierce and fearsome. But over time, her image softened into that of a beautiful, ageless woman of great wisdom and power. She was the keeper of the peaches of immortality, which ripened only once every 3,000 years. When they did ripen, she would host a great feast for the immortals, and any mortal fortunate or worthy enough to taste these peaches would be freed from the bonds of mortality. The mythology surrounding Kunlun and the Queen Mother resonated deeply with Chinese culture because it spoke to fundamental human yearnings. The desire for immortality, for wisdom, for transcendence of earthly limitations, all found expression in these stories. Emperors throughout Chinese history sought ways to reach Kunlun or to obtain the secrets of the immortals who dwelt there. Alchemists spent lifetimes trying to recreate the elixirs said to flow from Kunlun springs. The mountain became a symbol of ultimate spiritual achievement, the goal toward which all other paths ultimately led. But Kunlun was not the only sacred mountain in Chinese mythology. The tradition spoke of 5 great peaks, each associated with a cardinal direction in the center. These mountains were believed to have formed from the body of Pangu, the primordial being whose death created the world. Mount Tai, the eastern peak, was formed from Pangu's head and was associated with sunrise, birth, and renewal. It became the most sacred mountain for earthly worship, the place where emperors came to perform the Feng and Shan sacrifices, communicating directly with heaven. Each of these sacred mountains had its own character, its own mythology, its own role in the cosmic order. Mount Hua, the western peak, was known for its terrifying precipices and narrow paths, testing the courage of anyone who dared to climb it. Mount Hung in the north was associated with winter and water, while its southern namesake represented summer and fire. Mount Song, the central peak, was seen as the balance point, the axis around which the others revolved. Beyond these famous mountains, the landscape of China held thousands of lesser peaks, each with its own stories, its own resident spirits, its own mysteries. The classic of mountains and seas cataloged hundreds of these mountains, describing the strange creatures that dwelled upon them, the magical plants that grew on their slopes, the powerful beings who made them their homes. This text, compiled over centuries from countless sources, reads like a gazetteer of the impossible, each entry more fantastic than the last. Yet what makes these accounts truly remarkable is not their fantastical elements, but the detailed, matter-of-fact way they're presented. The classic describes mountains where birds with one wing must pair up to fly, where sheep grow like plants from the ground, where fish with human faces swim in mountain lakes. It mentions mountains that glow at night, that emit sounds like music that cause anyone who sees them to laugh or to weep. These descriptions blend the mythological with the observational, suggesting that for the ancient Chinese, the line between the natural and supernatural was far more permeable than we might imagine today. One particularly intriguing aspect of mountain mythology concerns the concept of cave heavens. These were believed to be vast spaces existing within or beneath mountains, entire worlds hidden from ordinary view. Some texts describe cave heavens as beautiful realms of eternal spring, where immortals lived in harmony and time flowed differently than in the mortal world. Other accounts speak of underground palaces lit by mysterious luminescence, where ancient spirits held court. The idea that mountains could contain spaces larger than their exterior dimensions suggests an understanding of reality quite different from our modern materialist view. In the mythological landscape, physical space was mutable, subject to spiritual laws as much as physical ones. A cave that appeared small from the outside might open into vast halls once you passed through the entrance. A journey of mere hours into such a space might encompass years or centuries in the outside world. This theme of time distortion in sacred or liminal spaces appears repeatedly in Chinese mythology and folklore. The story of Lu Chun and Ruan Zhao, two men who entered a mountain and encountered celestial maidens, illustrates this perfectly. The men spent what seemed like 6 months in the mountain paradise, but when they returned home, they found that generations had passed. Everyone they had known was long dead. The world they remembered had transformed beyond recognition. Unable to adjust to this new reality, they eventually returned to the mountain, never to be seen again. Similar tales appear across Chinese literature and folklore. A fisherman follows a stream into a mountain and discovers a hidden valley where people live in perfect harmony, untouched by the troubles of the outside world. A scholar seeking medicinal herbs wanders into a cave and finds a beautiful realm where he lives for what seems like days, only to emerge and discover decades have passed. A hunter pursues a white deer into the mists and encounters immortals playing chess, watching them for what feels like an hour before the game ends, and he finds that his axe handle has rotted away from the centuries that have actually elapsed. These stories served multiple functions in Chinese culture. On one level, they were entertainment, fantastic tales to pass long winter evenings. On another level, they were spiritual instruction, teaching about the illusory nature of time and the possibility of transcendence. But they also functioned as warnings. The mountains were powerful and unpredictable. Those who ventured too deep, who crossed invisible boundaries between the mundane and the sacred, might never return, or might return so changed that they could no longer fit into ordinary life. The Taoist tradition, which became so influential during the Tang Dynasty, embraced and elaborated these mountain mythologies. Taoism taught that immortals, or xian, could be found dwelling in remote mountain locations, accessible only to those who had achieved sufficient spiritual cultivation. These immortals were former humans who, through practice and discipline, had transformed themselves into beings beyond aging and death. They were said to subsist on mist and dew, to be able to fly through the air, to possess profound wisdom and magical powers. Mountain hermits were a recognized phenomenon in Chinese society. These were individuals, often scholars or failed examination candidates, who withdrew from society to live in remote mountain locations, pursuing spiritual practice or philosophical contemplation. Some of these hermits genuinely sought enlightenment. Others were essentially hiding from political troubles or personal failures. But the mountains gave them all the same thing: distance from the complications of civilized life, proximity to nature's raw power, and association with the mythological traditions of sacred peaks. The mountains also featured prominently in shamanic practices that predated and coexisted with more organized religious traditions. Shamans were specialists in navigating the boundaries between different realms of reality. They could journey to the spirit world and return with knowledge or healing. Mountains, with their association with celestial realms and their physical presence bridging earth and sky, were natural sites for shamanic activity. Certain peaks were known as places where the veil between worlds was particularly thin, where shaman might more easily access other dimensions of existence. This brings us to a crucial understanding for our story. When Zhang rode into the mountains on his final mission, he wasn't merely entering difficult terrain. In the cultural imagination of his time, he was approaching a threshold, a boundary between the known and the unknowable. The mountains represented possibility, both wonderful and terrifying. They were places where the normal rules might not apply, where time could flow strangely, where encounters with beings or forces beyond ordinary comprehension could occur. The Tang Dynasty, despite its administrative sophistication and its cosmopolitan culture, never fully rationalized the mountains. Official Confucian ideology might emphasize order and propriety, but it couldn't erase the deeper, older stories about what dwelt in the heights. Buddhist teachings brought their own mountain mythology, stories of bodhisattvas dwelling on sacred peaks, of mountains in India where the Buddha had achieved enlightenment, of cosmic mountains at the center of the universe. These Buddhist ideas blended with existing Chinese traditions, creating an even richer tapestry of mountain symbolism. The poet Li Bai, one of the Tang Dynasty's most celebrated literary figures, wrote extensively about mountains. His poems capture both their physical majesty and their spiritual significance. He describes mountains wreathed in clouds, their peaks disappearing into heaven. He writes of mountain streams so pure they seem to carry fragments of the celestial realm. He portrays mountains as places of profound solitude, where one could encounter the deepest truths about existence. Reading Li Bai, we sense how the mountains stirred something primal in the Chinese imagination, how they represented both the beauty and the terror of the natural world elevated to a cosmic scale. The relationship between humans and mountains in Chinese thought was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, mountains were seen as benevolent sources of water that fed the rivers, homes to valuable medicinal plants, barriers that protected against invaders. Mountain worship was an ancient and widespread practice, with people making offerings to mountain gods for good fortune, for rain, for protection. On the other hand, mountains were dangerous, filled with wild beasts, treacherous paths, and unpredictable weather. And they were powerful in a way that transcended simple physical danger. They represented forces older and greater than human civilization, forces that could be respected but never fully controlled. This duality of mountains, as both sanctuaries and threats, as both gateways to enlightenment and labyrinths of delusion, forms the backdrop against which we must understand what happened to Zhang Wei. He was a practical man, trained in concrete skills, focused on earthly duty. But the cultural context he inhabited was saturated with stories about mountains as liminal spaces, places where extraordinary things could happen, where the boundary between the possible and impossible became uncertain. The specific mountain pass where Zhang Wei's story unfolds was known by various names to the local people, though the official maps simply designated it by coordinates and elevation. The locals spoke of it with a certain wariness, never quite refusing to use it, but always treating it with respect. There were stories, of course. There are always stories about mountain passes. But these stories had an unusual consistency, an unsettling pattern. Too many travelers reported losing time there, arriving later than they should have. Too many described mists that came from nowhere, sounds that had no source, a sense of being watched by something vast and ancient. The station master at the approach to this pass was an old man who had held the position for decades. He had seen countless couriers ride through, and he had developed a sense, almost a sixth sense, for when something was amiss. He paid attention to the mountain's moods, to subtle signs that most people missed. On certain days, when the wind blew from a particular direction and the clouds hung at a certain height, he would advise couriers to wait, to let the mountains settle before attempting the crossing. Most took his advice. The wise ones always did. But as we'll see, wisdom and duty don't always align. The imperial postal system was built on the principle that messages must go through, that personal judgment couldn't override official priority. This principle served the empire well in most cases. It ensured reliability, prevented delays caused by timidity or laziness. But it also meant that sometimes couriers rode into situations that local knowledge would have warned them away from. They rode into storms because the dispatch couldn't wait. They crossed swollen rivers because the order was marked urgent. And sometimes they rode into mountains when the mountain was not in a mood to let them pass unchanged. Section 3. Our Courier. Zhang Wei's background. Zhang Wei had not been born to the courier service, though he would joke in later years that he must have been born running, given how his life turned out. He came from a village in Hunan province, a place of moderate prosperity tucked between larger population centers. His family worked the land, as farmers had for countless generations before them. They grew millet and wheat, tended vegetable gardens, raised a few chickens and a pig. It was not a life of luxury, but neither was it one of desperate poverty. They had enough to eat, a solid house, and the respect of their neighbors. Zhang Wei was the third son, a position that shaped much of his early life. The eldest son would inherit the family land. The second son was being educated slowly and at great expense, in the hope that he might pass the lower civil service examinations and bring honor to the family. This left Zhang Wei in an uncertain position. There wasn't enough land to divide further. The family couldn't afford to educate two sons. He would need to find his own path. From childhood, Zhang Wei had shown certain qualities that marked him as unusual. He had boundless energy, an inability to sit still that drove his mother to distraction. While other children might be content to play in the village, Zhang Wei would wander the surrounding countryside, exploring every path, climbing every climbable tree, investigating every stream and cave. His parents worried about this restlessness, seeing it as a character flaw that needed to be corrected. But his grandfather, a veteran of military campaigns in his youth, recognized something different. He saw potential. It was the grandfather who first suggested that Zhang Wei might be suited for government service of a physical nature, not as a scholar or an official, but as a soldier, perhaps, or as one of the various functionaries who kept the empire running through physical labor rather than scholarly achievement. The boy was strong for his age, quick-footed, and seemed to possess an innate sense of direction. Even in unfamiliar territory, Zhang Wei rarely got lost. He noticed landmarks, remembered paths, could find his way back from anywhere he had been. When Zhang Wei reached his 15th year, the grandfather made arrangements through old military connections for the boy to be tested for the courier service. It was a long journey to the provincial capital, the first time Zhang Wei had traveled more than a few miles from his home village. Everything about the trip was an education. The crowded roads, the variety of people, the different accents and customs encountered along the way, all of it opened Zhang Wei's eyes to the vastness of the world beyond his familiar horizons. The testing for courier positions was rigorous and multifaceted. Physical endurance was crucial, of course. The candidates ran a measured course while judges timed them with water clocks. They lifted heavy weights, demonstrating the strength needed to control a horse and to load and unload cargo at stations. They were questioned about their health history, their family background, any criminal associations, or political unreliability that might make them unsuitable. But there was more to the testing than just physical capacity. The examiners looked for signs of intelligence, the ability to think quickly and solve problems. They posed hypothetical situations. What would you do if your horse broke a leg in a remote area? What would you do if you encounter bandits? If you suspected a fellow courier of tampering with dispatches? The questions probed not just for knowledge, but for character, for judgment, for the kind of reliability that couldn't be faked or pretended. Zhang Wei excelled at these tests. His years of roaming the countryside had given him practical skills that many candidates, raised in cities or in more protective environments, simply didn't possess. He knew how to read the sky for weather changes. He could estimate distances accurately. He had learned basic horse care from helping neighbors with their plowing animals. And something in his demeanor, a directness mixed with deference, impressed the examiners. This was a young man who could be trusted, they concluded. This was someone who understood duty. Out of over 100 candidates tested that season, only 12 were selected for training. Zhang Wei was among them. The pride he felt at this selection was immense, matched only by his family's joy when he returned with the news. To have a son in Imperial service, even in a relatively humble capacity, was a significant achievement for a farming family. It meant connections, potential for advancement, a degree of status in the community. The training period lasted 6 months. 6 months of intensity that transformed Zhang Wei from an enthusiastic but raw young man into a disciplined professional. The training compound was located near a major postal route, allowing the instructors to demonstrate every aspect of the courier's work. The trainees learned horsemanship, not the refined riding of aristocrats, but the practical, enduring style needed for long-distance travel. They learned to mount and dismount quickly, to change horses with minimal delay, to handle animals that might be skittish or stubborn. They learned navigation, both by the sun and stars, and by the careful observation of landmarks. A good courier didn't need a map for routes he had traveled. He memorized them, noting particular trees, rock formations, streams, anything that could serve as a reference point. They learned to judge the condition of roads, to recognize when a path might become impassable in bad weather, to find alternative routes when necessary. The protocols of document handling received enormous emphasis. The trainee couriers practiced sealing and unsealing dispatch containers, learned to recognize the various official seals and what they signified, studied the security measures designed to prevent tampering. They memorized the regulations governing different classes of documents, which could be delayed by bad weather, which had to go through regardless, which required armed escort, which could be read at intermediate stations, and which must remain sealed until delivery. Perhaps most importantly, they learned discipline. The courier service demanded absolute reliability. Personal comfort, personal safety, even personal survival came secondary to completing the mission. This philosophy was drilled into the trainees day after day. They ran until their legs trembled with exhaustion, then were required to run more. They rode in all weather conditions, learning to push through rain, snow, extreme heat. They went without sleep, experiencing what it felt like to ride when fatigue made every movement an effort, because they would certainly face such conditions in actual service. The training was not without its casualties. 3 of the 12 candidates dropped out, unable or unwilling to meet the demands. One suffered a serious injury during a training exercise and was discharged. But Zhang thrived. The rigors that broke others seemed to energize him. He had found his calling, a path that channeled his restlessness into something purposeful and valued. When the training period ended and the surviving candidates were officially inducted into the courier service, Zhang took his oath with a fierce pride and determination. His first assignment was to a posting on a relatively easy route, standard practice for new couriers. This route connected 2 provincial capitals through well-settled country, good roads, and frequent stations. It allowed him to learn the rhythms of the work without being immediately thrown into the most dangerous or demanding situations. For a year, he ran this route, becoming familiar with every station master, every peculiarity of the path. The work settled into a pattern, but it was never routine. Each journey brought something different. Sometimes the weather challenged him. Sometimes he carried dispatches of unusual importance, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with critical information. Sometimes he encountered interesting people at the stations, officials or travelers with stories from distant parts of the empire. Sometimes the work was lonely and hard, riding through the night with nothing but his thoughts and the sound of hoofbeats for company. Zhang proved himself capable and reliable. The station masters praised him in their reports. He was punctual, careful with documents, respectful of protocol. After his first year, he received his first promotion, a small increase in pay and a commendation in his file. More significantly, he was reassigned to a more challenging route, one that took him through mountainous country with more isolated stations and greater distances between them. This new assignment tested him in ways the training had only hinted at. The mountains demanded different skills, different awareness. He learned to read the weather signs specific to high country, to recognize when a storm was building even before the first clouds appeared. He learned the particular difficulties of maintaining speed at altitude, where both horse and rider tired more quickly. He experienced his first serious danger when a rock slide nearly caught him in a narrow pass, teaching him vigilance and the need for constant awareness of his surroundings. But he also discovered something unexpected in these mountains. He loved them. Despite the dangers, despite the hardships, there was something about the mountain landscape that spoke to something deep in Zhang Wei's character. The vast vistas, the clean air, the sense of being elevated above the ordinary world, all of it resonated with him. During brief rest periods at mountain stations, he would stand outside and simply look, absorbing the majesty of the peaks, feeling small and yet part of something immense. The local people in these mountain regions had their own character, distinct from the plains folk he had grown up among. They were harder, more self-sufficient, more inclined to silence than chatter. But they respected competence, and they came to respect Zhang Wei. They saw that he didn't treat the mountains casually, that he understood the need for respect and caution. The old station master at the approach to the highest pass on his route, a grizzled man who had seen decades of couriers come and go, developed a particular fondness for Zhang Wei, seeing in him a kindred spirit who understood that the mountains were not merely obstacles to overcome, but forces to acknowledge and respect. Over the next several years, Zhang Wei continued his service, building an exemplary record. He married a local girl from one of the mountain villages on his route. She understood the nature of his work, the long absences, the dangers. They established a simple household near one of the larger stations, a place where he could return between runs. In time, they had a daughter, a bright-eyed child who would run to greet him when he returned from missions, her joy at his homecomings making the hardships of the road seem worthwhile. But Zhang Wei's dedication to duty never wavered. When the dispatch orders came, he went regardless of weather, regardless of personal convenience, regardless of the desire to stay home with his family. This was the compact he had made with the Empire. His reliability was what he offered in exchange for his position, his income, the respect he enjoyed. And beyond the practical considerations, there was genuine belief. Zhang Wei had come to see his work as meaningful in a larger sense. He was a cell in the Empire's body, carrying its vital messages, helping maintain the communication that kept civilization functioning. This wasn't mere transportation. This was service in the truest sense. It was this combination of skill, experience, dedication, and perhaps a certain humility born from years in the mountains that made Zhang Wei the obvious choice when a particularly urgent and difficult mission needed to be assigned. The dispatch came from the capital itself, sealed with the highest level of Imperial authorization. It needed to reach a military command in a remote northwestern region, and it needed to go quickly, using the most direct route. That route passed through a mountain region known for difficulty and occasional strange occurrences, through a particular pass that even experienced couriers approached with caution. The regional courier supervisor, reviewing the roster of available men, came to Zhang Wei's name and stopped. Here was a man with 8 years of solid service, extensive mountain experience, an unblemished record. If anyone could be trusted with this mission, it was Zhang Wei. The supervisor summoned him, explained the situation, and offered him the assignment. It wasn't quite an order, not technically. The courier service recognized that some missions carried unusual risk, and they allowed couriers some discretion in accepting them. Zhang Wei listened to the briefing, asked practical questions about the route, the weather expectations, the resources available at the mountain stations. He sought no special considerations, made no requests for extra compensation or support. When the supervisor finished explaining and asked if he would take the mission, Zhang Wei simply nodded. "I will carry the dispatch," he said, using the formal phrase that committed a courier to a particular assignment. Before departing, Zhang Wei visited his family. He held his daughter, told his wife he expected to be back in 2 weeks, and made the small practical arrangements that a responsible man makes before embarking on a dangerous journey. His wife watched him prepare his equipment with the stoic acceptance she had learned over their years together. She didn't ask him not to go. She understood that, for Zhang Wei, the question of whether to go had never really existed. The dispatch needed carrying. He was a courier. These were the only facts that mattered. What Zhang Wei didn't know, couldn't know, as he rode out on what he thought would be a difficult but ultimately routine mission, was that he was riding towards something that would transcend all his experience, all his training, all his understanding of how the world worked. The mountain he approached was not merely difficult. It was extraordinary in ways that the official maps couldn't capture, in ways that even the local legends only hinted at. Section 4. The final mission begins. The morning Zhang Wei departed on his final documented mission dawned clear and cold, the kind of bright autumn day that makes the world seem sharp and precisely defined. He had spent the night at a station near the foot of the mountains, having completed the first leg of his journey without incident. The dispatch tube was secured in his saddlebag, sealed with wax bearing the Imperial cipher. Its weight was negligible, just a few ounces of bamboo and paper, yet it carried an authority that outweighed any physical mass. The station master at this location was a man named Wu, a former courier himself who had earned this posting through long service and a catastrophic knee injury that had ended his riding days. Wu had greeted Zhang Wei the previous evening with a professional courtesy that one courier always extended to another, offering the best the station could provide: a warm meal, clean bedding, and the company of someone who understood the nature of the work. Over the evening meal, Wu had asked about Zhang Wei's route. When Zhang Wei mentioned he would be taking the pass known locally as Ghost Wind Gap, Wu's expression had changed subtly. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. A tightening around the eyes, a thoughtful pause before responding. "That's a difficult crossing in the best conditions," Wu said carefully. "And these are not the best conditions." He explained that there had been strange weather in the high country recently. Fogs appearing from nowhere. Winds that seemed to blow from all directions at once. Several merchants who had crossed the pass in recent weeks had reported unusual experiences. Nothing definite, Wu stressed, just odd sensations, moments of disorientation, an atmosphere that felt somehow off. Zhang Wei listened respectfully. He knew that old couriers, especially those who had worked mountain routes, accumulated a kind of wisdom that went beyond the official manuals. But he also knew the nature of the dispatch he carried. It was marked with symbols indicating military urgency and imperial priority. The kind of dispatch that couldn't be delayed for vague concerns about unusual weather or strange atmospheres. "I appreciate the warning," Zhang Wei told Wu. "I'll be cautious, but the dispatch can't wait." Wu nodded, unsurprised. He had known what Zhang Wei's answer would be before asking the question. "Then take this advice," he said, reaching beneath the counter and producing a small charm, a piece of jade carved with protective symbols. "The locals say the mountain has moods. If you feel the mood is dangerous, if your instincts tell you something is wrong, trust them. Find shelter and wait. No dispatch is worth your life, whatever the official regulations say." Zhang Wei accepted the charm. more out of politeness than belief. He wasn't particularly superstitious. Years of courier work had taught him that dangers were generally mundane, bandits and weather and treacherous footing, things that could be addressed through vigilance and skill. Still, he tucked the charm into his jacket. It was a kind gesture, and he saw no reason to refuse it. That night, Zhang Wei slept the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had learned to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself. But in the hours before dawn, something woke him. Not a sound exactly, more like a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift that his unconscious mind registered and flagged as important. He lay in the darkness, listening. The station was quiet. Outside, he could hear the normal sounds of horses in their stables, the distant call of a night bird, the whisper of wind through trees. Yet something felt different. The air had a quality he couldn't quite name, a thickness or a resonance that seemed unusual. He rose, dressed, and stepped outside. The stars overhead blazed with unusual clarity, and the mountains loomed as dark masses against the star field. As he watched, he saw what looked like a faint glow along one of the peaks, a phosphorescence that might have been moonlight on snow, except that the moon had already set. The phenomenon lasted only a moment, then faded. Zhang Wei stood in the courtyard, feeling the cold air on his face, wondering if he had actually seen something or if his eyes had played tricks in the darkness. A noise behind him made him turn. It was Wu, also awake, also staring toward the mountains. "You saw it too," Wu said. It wasn't a question. "What was it?" Wu shook his head. "I don't know. It happens sometimes, especially in autumn. The locals have various explanations, all of them involving spirits or immortals or things I'm not educated enough to understand. All I know is that when the mountain glows like that, strange things tend to happen in the past." Zhang Wei felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. For the first time, he felt genuine uncertainty about his mission. But even as the doubt surfaced, his training and his sense of duty pushed it aside. The Empire depended on the courier service functioning reliably. If every unusual phenomenon became an excuse for delay, the entire system would break down. "I'll be careful," he told Wu. "If conditions in the pass are truly impassable, I'll turn back and report. But I need to at least attempt the crossing." Wu said nothing more. He simply nodded and returned inside, leaving Zhang Wei alone with the stars and the dark shape of the mountains and a feeling of foreboding that he couldn't quite shake. Dawn arrived with its usual punctuality, and with the sun's light, Zhang Wei's concerns seemed less weighty. Mountains always looked ominous at night. The glow had probably been some natural phenomenon, perhaps something to do with the particular minerals in that peak's composition. He completed his morning preparations methodically, checked his horse's condition, ensuring the animal was rested and sound, verified that the dispatch tube was still properly sealed, packed emergency supplies, dried meat, and hardtack in case he got stranded by weather. Wu provided a good breakfast and fresh supplies for the journey. As Zhang Wei was mounting his horse, Wu approached one final time. "The next station is maintained by an old man named Feng," Wu said. "He's lived near that pass for 40 years. If anyone can read the mountain's mood, it's him. Listen to what he tells you." Zhang Wei thanked Wu and rode out, pointing his horse toward the mountains. The road began its climb almost immediately, leaving the agricultural lands behind and entering the forest zone that clothed the lower slopes. The morning was still clear, the air fresh with the scent of pine and the distant promise of snow. Under other circumstances, it would have been a beautiful ride. The path wound upward through the forest for several hours. Zhang Wei maintained a steady pace, conserving his horse's energy for the more difficult terrain ahead. He passed occasional signs of other traffic. A merchant caravan had come through within the last day or two, leaving fresh droppings and disturbed dust. A solitary traveler on foot, perhaps a pilgrim or a wandering monk, had left prints in a soft section of trail. The presence of these traces was reassuring, evidence that the route remained passable and in use. Around midday, Zhang Wei reached the middle station, where he would exchange his current mount for a fresh horse. This station was smaller than the one he'd left that morning, basically just a stable, a keeper's hut, and a small supply shed. The keeper was a young man, barely more than a boy, who clearly found the isolation difficult. He was eager for conversation, asking Zhang Wei about news from the lower stations, about the wider world. Zhang Wei shared what he could while the horses were being switched. The young keeper didn't seem to know much about the pass ahead, or perhaps he chose not to speak of it. When Zhang Wei asked about recent conditions, the young man simply shrugged. People come through. People go. I'm not here long enough to know what's normal. This answer was both honest and unhelpful, leaving Zhang Wei with no new information, but also no particular cause for concern. With a fresh horse, Zhang Wei continued upward. The forest began to thin as he gained altitude, the trees becoming more scattered and gnarled, shaped by constant wind into twisted forms. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Zhang Wei was glad for his thick jacket and the fur-lined cap he'd brought for this section of the journey. The path became rougher, strewn with loose rock that forced him to slow his pace and pick his way carefully. It was late afternoon when he reached the upper station, the last outpost before the pass itself. This station had a more substantial construction than the middle one, built to withstand harsh mountain weather. Stone walls 2 feet thick, narrow windows that could be shuttered against storms, a roof of thick wooden shingles held down by heavy rocks. The stable was carved partially into the mountainside itself, providing additional protection for the animals. As Zhang Wei dismounted, an old man emerged from the station house. This would be Feng, the keeper who had mentioned. He was ancient, his face creased by decades of mountain weather, his eyes sharp despite his age. He looked at Zhang Wei, then past him at the sky, then back to Zhang Wei's face. A courier, and carrying urgency, Feng said. It wasn't a question. Somehow, he had read the situation in Zhang Wei's bearing or equipment, and intending to cross tonight, no doubt, because the dispatch won't wait for morning. Can it be done? Zhang Wei asked. Is the pass open? Feng gestured for Zhang Wei to follow him into the station house, where a fire burned in a stone hearth. A pot of tea hung over the flames, filling the single room with a pleasant aroma. Feng poured 2 cups and handed one to Zhang Wei before speaking. The pass is physically open, Feng said slowly. There's no snow blocking it, no rock slide. A capable rider with a good horse could make it to the other side in 2, perhaps 3 hours. But, Zhang Wei prompted, hearing the unspoken reservation. But the mountain is not welcoming today. I've seen this before, these conditions. The air has a weight to it. The wind sounds wrong. Things feel. He paused, searching for the right word, displaced. Zhang Wei sipped his tea, considering. Displaced was an odd choice of word, both specific and vague. What does that mean exactly? Feng shook his head. It's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. Distance becomes uncertain. Time becomes slippery. What should take an hour takes 3 or 15 minutes. You reach for something, and it's not quite where it should be. You hear sounds that come from the wrong direction. It's like the mountain is showing you a different version of itself, one that doesn't quite match reality. Have you experienced this yourself? Zhang Wei asked. Several times, Feng confirmed, and I've spoken with dozens of travelers who reported similar things. Not everyone, mind you. Most crossings are perfectly normal, even in these strange conditions. But some people, for reasons I don't understand, encounter difficulty. Zhang Wei finished his tea and stood. I appreciate the warning, but I'm sworn to deliver this dispatch. Unless you can tell me the pass is completely impassable, I need to proceed. Feng studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I knew you would say that. I've seen many couriers over the years. The truly dedicated ones always say that. He rose and walked to a shelf, taking down a small lantern. Take this. If you do encounter the strangeness, if the mountain shows you its other face, light will help. Not because it illuminates, but because it gives you something real to focus on, something that reminds you of the ordinary world. Zhang Wei accepted the lantern, adding it to his equipment. Feng helped him prepare a fresh horse, the station's best, a sturdy mountain-bred animal with the calm temperament needed for difficult crossings. As Zhang Wei mounted, Feng offered one final piece of advice. If you find yourself lost, if nothing looks right, stop moving. Sit down, light the lantern, and wait. The mountain's strange moods usually pass. When things settle, when reality feels solid again, then continue. Don't try to push through the strangeness. You'll only go deeper into it. Zhang Wei nodded his understanding, touched his heels to the horse's flanks, and started up the trail toward the pass. Behind him, Feng stood watching until horse and rider disappeared around a bend in the path. The old keeper's expression was troubled, worried in a way he couldn't quite articulate. He had given the best advice he could. Now the rest was up to the courier and whatever forces govern the mountain's moods. The trail climbed steeply from the station, switchbacking up a rocky slope. Zhang Wei let the horse set its own pace, trusting the animal's mountain sense to find the safest footing. The sun was lowering toward the western peaks, casting long shadows across the path. In an hour, perhaps less, it would be dark. As he climbed, Zhang Wei began to notice the qualities Feng had mentioned. The air did feel heavy, weighted with something he couldn't identify. The usual mountain sounds, the whisper of wind through rocks, the call of birds, seemed muted, as if coming from a great distance. His horse's hoofbeats sounded oddly flat, lacking their normal sharp report. He told himself it was just his imagination, primed by Feng's warnings and Wu's concerns. The mind could play tricks, especially when one expected strangeness. He focused on the practical matters of the ride. Watch the path. Monitor the horse's breathing. Keep a steady pace. These were things he knew, things he could control. The last of the direct sunlight faded as Zhang Wei approached the entrance to the pass proper. Here the mountain walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural corridor just wide enough for the path. The rock faces showed strata of different colored stone, layers compressed over countless ages. In the dying light, these layers seemed to ripple slightly, as if the stone itself was breathing. Zhang Wei blinked, looking again. The stone was solid, unmoving, exactly as it should be. Just a trick of the fading light and his tired eyes, he told himself. He pulled out the lantern Feng had given him, considering whether to light it now or wait for full darkness. The decision was made for him. As he sat there, lantern in hand, a fog began to rise from the ground ahead, not drifting in on wind, but simply appearing, materializing out of nothing. One moment the path ahead was clear. The next, it was obscured by a thick, pearl-gray mist that seemed to glow with its own internal light. Zhang Wei felt his horse shift nervously beneath him. The animal sensed something wrong, wanted to turn back. For a moment, Zhang Wei shared that instinct. Every rational part of his mind was screaming that proceeding further would be a mistake. The fog was not natural. The atmosphere was not right. Something was deeply wrong with this place, this moment. But pressed against his side, he could feel the dispatch tube. Inside it, orders from the Emperor, messages that could save lives, that could alter the course of battles, that represented the will of the Empire made tangible. Zhang Wei had sworn an oath. He had built his entire adult life around the principle of delivering whatever he carried, regardless of personal cost. He lit the lantern, and its warm yellow light pushed back a small circle of the fog. Then, with a deep breath and a whispered prayer to whatever gods might watch over couriers, Zhang Wei urged his horse forward into the mist. The world changed. Section 5. Entering the mountain's embrace. The moment Zhang Wei passed into the fog, sound altered in a way that defied natural explanation. His horse's hoofbeats, which had been echoing off the canyon walls, suddenly stopped making echoes. Each step produced only the immediate sound and nothing more, as if the mist absorbed all resonance. Even his own breathing seemed dampened, flattened, occurring in a space that refused normal acoustic rules. The fog was not cold, as mountain mist should be. Instead, it had a neutral temperature, neither warm nor cool, as if the concept of temperature had become optional within its boundaries. Zhang Wei held the lantern higher, but its light behaved strangely, illuminating a perfect sphere around him, but seeming unable to penetrate more than a few feet in any direction. Beyond that small circle of visibility, the gray was absolute. His horse moved forward cautiously, one slow step at a time. Zhang Wei gave the animal its head, trusting its instincts more than his own limited vision. Time began to feel elastic. He counted paces in his mind, trying to maintain some sense of distance covered, but the numbers seemed to slip away from him. Had he counted 100 or 300? How long had he been in the fog? Minutes? Hours? The path beneath the horse's hooves felt solid enough, but Zhang Wei couldn't shake the sensation that it was rising and falling in ways it shouldn't, that the angle of the slope kept changing in impossible ways. At one point, he could have sworn he was climbing steeply, his body leaning forward in the saddle, but when he looked down at the lantern in his hand, the oil in its reservoir stayed perfectly level, indicating flat ground. He remembered Feng's advice. If things became too strange, stop and wait. But how strange was too strange? The fog was unusual, certainly, but not actively dangerous. The path continued beneath him. The horse, while nervous, was still moving forward. To stop now, when he could still make progress, seemed like surrendering to a rational fear. So Zhang Wei continued, deeper into the mist, further into what he was beginning to suspect was not entirely natural. The fog began to show variations in density, becoming slightly clearer in some places, almost opaque in others. He started to see shapes in these variations, patterns that his mind wanted to interpret as meaningful. A face forming and dissolving in the swirls. A hand reaching, a figure walking parallel to his path. He forced his attention away from these phantoms, focusing instead on the immediate reality of the path, the horse, the lantern's glow. Real things, solid things. But even these anchors to reality began to feel uncertain. The path beneath him sometimes felt soft, almost springy, like walking on moss instead of stone. The horse seemed to change size subtly, now feeling slightly larger beneath him, now slightly smaller. Time continued its strange behavior. Zhang Wei's internal sense of duration, usually quite reliable after years of courier work, completely failed him. He had no idea how long he had been riding through the fog. It could have been an hour. It could have been 10 minutes. His mind couldn't maintain coherent measurement. Then, without warning, the fog began to thin. Not gradually, but suddenly, as if he had passed through an invisible boundary. One moment he could see only a few feet. The next, his vision extended to normal distance. He was still in the pass, rocky walls rising on either side, but the mist had released him. Zhang Wei stopped his horse and looked back. Behind him, the fog formed a solid wall, gray and impenetrable. Ahead, the path continued clear under a sky that showed stars. He checked the position of those stars, trying to orient himself to determine how much time had actually passed. But the constellations were not quite in the positions he expected. They had wheeled further across the sky than they should have, suggesting hours had passed, though his subjective experience had felt much shorter. The horse snorted and shook its head, as if clearing away the memory of the fog. Zhang Wei sympathized with the impulse, but there was no time to dwell on the strangeness they had just experienced. He needed to keep moving to complete the crossing while conditions remained clear. He urged the horse forward, trying to regain the time lost to the fog. The path here was straightforward, a relatively level stretch between the high walls of the pass. Zhang Wei settled into the rhythm of the ride, pushing his earlier unease aside, focusing on the practical matter of making distance. But the mountain was not finished with him. The first sign that something new was wrong came as a change in the light. The stars overhead began to brighten, becoming more luminous than stars should be, casting actual shadows on the ground. Zhang Wei looked up, amazed and alarmed, watching as the night sky took on an intensity that was almost painful to behold. It was as if the stars had moved closer, or as if some barrier that normally dimmed their light had been removed. In that strange, stellar brilliance, Zhang Wei saw the mountain walls on either side of the pass in perfect detail, every crack and crevice rendered sharp. And in those rock faces, he began to notice something impossible. The stone was moving, flowing like water, rippling and reforming. Not violently or chaotically, but with a slow, purposeful motion, as if the mountains themselves were breathing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm too vast and slow for human comprehension. Zhang Wei stopped his horse again, staring at the rock faces, trying to convince himself he was seeing an optical illusion, a trick of the strange light. But the motion was undeniable, too consistent and clear to be denied. The very substance of the mountain was behaving in ways that stone could not behave. A sound reached his ears, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. It was like music, but music played on no instrument Zhang Wei had ever heard. Tones that seemed to come from the rock itself. Harmonies that resonated in his bones rather than his ears. The music, if it could be called that, had a quality that was simultaneously beautiful and unsettling, drawing him forward while also making him want to flee. His horse, surprisingly, seemed calmed by the sound. The animal's earlier nervousness faded, replaced by an almost dreamy quality. It began walking forward without prompting, following the path as if pulled by an invisible thread. Zhang Wei let it go, no longer certain he could make better decisions than the horse about where to proceed. The pass opened ahead into a wider space, a natural amphitheater in the mountains. Zhang Wei emerged into this space and found himself in a scene that could not exist, that violated everything he understood about the physical world. The amphitheater was filled with light, but not starlight, not lantern light. This was a soft, diffuse illumination that seemed to emanate from the air itself, from the stones, from everything and nothing all at once. In this light, Zhang Wei saw structures, buildings that should not be in this remote mountain pass. Towers of some translucent material that looked like jade or glass, but clearly possessed properties of neither. Bridges spanning gaps between rock formations, constructed in impossible arches that defied gravity. Gardens growing in terrace levels, filled with plants that glowed softly in colors Zhang Wei had no names for. And figures. Zhang Wei saw people, or beings that resembled people, moving through this impossible architecture. They were tall and graceful, dressed in flowing garments that seemed to be made of light more than cloth. Some were walking along the bridges. Others were tending the gardens. None of them seemed to notice Zhang Wei, or if they did, they gave no sign of it. Zhang Wei sat frozen on his horse, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Was this real? Was he hallucinating? Had he somehow been drugged without knowing it? Or had he crossed some threshold, passed into a realm that existed alongside ordinary reality, but separate from it? The kind of place the old story spoke of, but which he had never quite believed could be real. One of the glowing figures stopped its activity and turned to look directly at him. Even at a distance, Zhang Wei could feel the weight of that gaze, could sense an intelligence and awareness that was fundamentally different from human consciousness. The figure raised a hand, not threatening, but beckoning, inviting Zhang Wei to approach. Every instinct Zhang Wei possessed screamed at him to turn around, to ride back the way he had come, to flee this impossible place and never speak of what he had seen. But alongside the fear was a profound curiosity, a need to understand what this was, what was happening to him. And underneath both fear and curiosity was the stubborn core of duty that had defined his adult life. His mission wasn't complete. The dispatch needed to reach its destination. He couldn't turn back until he had either succeeded or been absolutely prevented from proceeding. Zhang Wei urged his horse forward, slowly, carefully, approaching the beckoning figure. As he drew closer, he could see more detail in the being's appearance. It had a human-like form, but the proportions were subtly wrong, the limbs slightly longer than they should be, the face both familiar and alien. The eyes were the most striking feature, larger than human eyes, with an iridescence that shifted through colors as the being moved. When Zhang Wei was perhaps 20 feet away, the figure spoke. The language was not one Zhang Wei knew, yet somehow he understood the meaning, as if the words were being translated directly into concepts in his mind without the intermediate step of linguistic processing. "You have entered the realm between," the figure said, "the place where the mountain holds its true nature. You are fortunate and unfortunate in equal measure." Zhang Wei found his voice, though it came out rougher than he intended. "What is this place? Who are you?" "We are those who dwell in the spaces mortal geography cannot contain," the figure replied. And this place is what remains when a mountain grows old enough to remember what it was before the earth hardened. Here, time moves by different rules. Here, the laws that bind your world have less authority. Zhang Wei's hand moved unconsciously to the dispatch tube at his side. The gesture did not go unnoticed. You carry something you consider important, the figure observed. A message from one of your kind to another. You have come this way because you are committed to delivering it. Yes, Zhang Wei said simply. I am an Imperial Courier. It's my duty to complete my mission. The figure tilted its head in a gesture that might have been curiosity or amusement. Duty, an interesting concept. You bind yourself to a task and continue even when the task leads you into danger, into the unknown. Even when you know that proceeding may cost you everything. The Empire depends on the courier service, Zhang Wei said, feeling the need to explain, to justify. If we fail to deliver because things seem difficult or strange, the entire system collapses. Communication breaks down. The realm fragments. And this concerns you? The figure asked. The coherence of a political entity? Even though that entity will not last. Even though it is merely one brief configuration in the endless flux of human affairs. Zhang Wei had no immediate answer to this. He had never thought of the empire in such terms. It was simply the fundamental reality of his world, the organizing principle of civilization. Where am I? He asked instead. How do I complete my crossing? The figure gestured toward the impossible architecture surrounding them. You stand in what your myths call a cave heaven, though there is no cave. A space within the mountain that exists in parallel to your ordinary world. Travelers stumble into such places occasionally when conditions align in particular ways. Most pass through without truly seeing what they traverse, their minds unable to process the inconsistencies they encounter. But you have seen clearly, perhaps because you carry something of significance, something that creates a resonance with this realm. How do I leave? Zhang Wei pressed. How do I continue my journey? There are 3 paths before you, the figure said, and as it spoke, Zhang Wei could suddenly see what it described. 3 different routes leading out of the amphitheater, each one impossible in its own way. The first path leads back the way you came. You will emerge from the pass as if you had never entered this space. Time will not have advanced beyond the few hours you have subjectively experienced. You can return to your normal life, follow a report about impassable conditions, and avoid the strangeness entirely. The second path? Zhang Wei asked. The second path leads forward, but not in your time. If you take it, you will complete your crossing, but when you emerge, you will find that decades have passed in your world. Your family will be old or dead. The empire will have changed. The message you carry will be meaningless. But you will have succeeded, in a technical sense, in crossing the mountain. Zhang Wei felt a chill at this description. To emerge into a world where everyone he knew had aged beyond recognition. To find his daughter grown old while he remained unchanged, the thought was horrifying. And the third path. The figure's expression, insofar as Zhang Wei could read it, became more serious. The third path leads to service of a different kind. We who dwell in the between places maintain them, keep them functioning, prevent them from collapsing into chaos or merging destructively with your ordinary world. It is demanding work, requiring attention and care across spans of time that would exhaust any mortal life. But for those willing to make the commitment, there are compensations. You would cease to age. You would gain understanding of the true structure of reality. and you would serve a purpose larger than any empire. Zhang Wei sat silent on his horse, processing these impossible options. None of them allowed him to simply complete his mission and return home. Either he abandoned the mission, or he completed it at the cost of everything he knew, or he accepted a transformation into something he couldn't comprehend. "Is there no fourth path?" he finally asked. "No way to cross normally, to finish my task and return to my life?" The figure was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There is always uncertainty in such matters. The mountain's moods are not perfectly predictable. If you refuse all three paths I have described, if you simply ride forward with your eyes open, accepting whatever comes, then perhaps you will find your own way through. But I cannot promise what that would entail. You would be navigating by intuition through a realm that does not operate by intuitive rules." Zhang Wei looked around at the impossible architecture, at the glowing gardens, at the other figures moving through their timeless activities. Part of him wanted to accept the third path, to stay in this strange place and learn its secrets. The temptation was real and strong. But deeper than that temptation was something else, a fundamental commitment to the world he came from, to the people who depended on him, to the simple but meaningful purpose his life had held. "I will ride forward," Zhang Wei said. "I cannot turn back from my duty. I cannot accept a success that costs me everyone I love, and I cannot abandon my world for yours, no matter how wondrous it is. So I choose the uncertain path. I choose to continue and accept whatever comes of it." The figure regarded him for a long moment, then gave what might have been a nod of respect. "So be it. You have chosen bravely, if not wisely. Ride through our realm, courier of the ephemeral empire. Keep your purpose clear in your mind. Focus on your destination, your mission, the people you serve. Let these things be your compass through the strangeness. And perhaps, if you are fortunate, you will find your way back to the world you know." The figure stepped aside, and Zhang Wei urged his horse forward, riding between the impossible towers, across bridges that shouldn't exist, through gardens that grew in defiance of all horticultural possibility. The other glowing beings watched him pass, but did not interfere. He kept his eyes forward, his mind focused on his mission as the figure had suggested, trying not to be distracted by the wonders and impossibilities surrounding him. The path led him through the amphitheater and into another section of the pass, but this section bore no resemblance to any mountain terrain Zhang Wei had ever traversed. The walls here were not stone, but something more fluid, more mutable. They shifted and flowed like the surface of a slow river, never quite settling into permanent form. The ground beneath his horse's hooves was solid, but somehow felt like it was moving, a gentle conveyance carrying them forward without effort. Time became meaningless. Zhang Wei could not tell if he rode for minutes or hours or days. His horse seemed tireless, continuing at a steady pace without rest or water. He himself felt no fatigue, no hunger, no thirst. It was as if all the normal needs and limitations of the body had been temporarily suspended. Strange sights appeared alongside the path. He saw what looked like memories, scenes from his own life projected into the shifting walls. His childhood village, his wife on their wedding day, his daughter taking her first steps. These visions were so real, he could almost reach out and touch them. But whenever he tried, they dissolved like morning mist. He saw other things too, events he didn't recognize. Battles between warriors in unfamiliar armor. Cities built in architectural styles he had never encountered. Landscapes that couldn't exist on any map he knew. Whether these were glimpses of the past the future, or parallel realities, he had no way to determine. Through all of this, Zhang Wei maintained his focus on the dispatch tube, on his mission, on the need to deliver the message he carried. This focus became his anchor, the one constant in a journey that had abandoned all other constants. As long as he held to his purpose, as long as he kept his mind fixed on his duty, he felt he could maintain some connection to the reality he came from. The path eventually began to change again, becoming more solid, more conventionally physical. The shifting walls stabilized into normal stone. The strange, timeless feelings started to fade, replaced by ordinary fatigue and awareness of his body's needs. Zhang Wei recognized these changes as signs that he was approaching the boundary of the realm between, returning to normal reality. The final transition happened not with a dramatic moment, but with a gradual shift, like waking slowly from a vivid dream. The path simply became an ordinary mountain trail again. The sky overhead showed normal stars in their expected positions. The air had the normal cool bite of high altitude at night. Zhang Wei looked around and found himself on a familiar-looking section of path, one that matched the descriptions he had studied before beginning his journey. He had crossed the pass, or he had crossed something. Whether it was the same pass he had entered or some parallel version of it, he couldn't be certain. But ahead of him, the path led downward, toward the northwestern regions where his dispatch was addressed. Zhang Wei urged his exhausted horse forward, descending from the heights. As he rode, he began to notice certain details that troubled him. The vegetation seemed slightly different than it should be at this elevation. The angle of the terrain wasn't quite matching the mental map he had formed from his pre-mission research. Small things, inconsistencies that might mean nothing or might mean everything. When he finally reached the station on the far side of the mountain range, dawn was breaking. The station master emerged to greet him, and Zhang Wei felt a shock of relief at seeing another normal human being after his surreal journey. But as he dismounted and handed over his horse for care, the station master gave him a puzzled look. "Forgive me," the man said, "but you look familiar. Have you been through this station before?" Zhang Wei shook his head. "This is my first time on this route. I'm carrying an urgent dispatch from the capital." The station master's puzzlement deepened. "That's strange. You look remarkably like a courier who passed through here." "Well, it must have been 20 years ago now. I was just a young assistant then." The resemblance is uncanny. Zhang Wei felt a chill run through him. "What happened to this courier?" he asked carefully. "Oh, he completed his delivery and returned. Last I heard, he'd retired from service and was living with his family in one of the mountain villages. But as I said, that was 20 years ago. He'd be an old man by now." The station master peered more closely at Zhang Wei. "Yet you can't be much past 30, if that. I must be mistaken in the resemblance." Zhang Wei thanked the station master and made his way to the dispatch office to log his arrival. His hands shook slightly as he filled out the paperwork, noting the date he had departed and checking it against the date on the station's calendar. According to the records, he had been in the mountains for only 3 days. By all official reckoning, this was a routine, if somewhat slow crossing, nothing remarkable. But Zhang Wei knew better. He had experienced something in that mountain pass, something that the records couldn't capture and that he wasn't sure he could explain even if someone asked. The realm between, the glowing figures, the impossible architecture, the choice he had made to navigate by purpose rather than accepting any of the defined paths. And now there was the station master's strange comment about a courier who looked like him but who had passed through 20 years earlier. What did that mean? Had time somehow looped back on itself? Was he the same person as that earlier courier, his journey through the timeless realm creating some kind of paradox? Or was the resemblance simply coincidence, the mountain's final mysterious gift? Zhang Wei delivered his dispatch as required. The military commander who received it thanked him for his quick completion of a difficult route. Everything proceeded normally, routinely. No one seemed to notice anything strange about Zhang Wei or his journey. But when he began the return trip, Zhang Wei couldn't bring himself to take the same mountain pass. Instead, he detoured several days out of his way to use an alternative route, one that was longer and more difficult, but which didn't carry the same otherworldly charge. His superiors noted this detour in his record and questioned him about it, but Zhang Wei offered only vague explanations about weather conditions and road safety. He couldn't tell them the truth. Who would believe it? Over the weeks and months that followed, Zhang Wei tried to return to normal life. He completed his courier assignments. He spent time with his family. He followed all the protocols and routines that had defined his career. But something had changed in him. The experience in a mountain had opened a door in his understanding, had shown him that reality was larger and stranger than he had previously conceived. He found himself watching the mountains differently, seeing them not just as geographical features, but as living things with their own depths and mysteries. He became more attentive to the stories other couriers told about strange encounters in remote regions, stories he had previously dismissed as exaggeration or imagination. He began to wonder how many other people had stumbled into realms like the one he had traversed, how many had accepted the various paths offered to them, how many had chosen as he did and somehow found their way back. Section 6. Legacy and Mystery. The question of what really happened to Zhang Wei in that mountain pass never received a definitive answer, at least not in any official record. As far as the Imperial Postal Service was concerned, Courier Zhang Wei had completed a difficult crossing in acceptable time, delivered his dispatch without incident, and returned to continue his regular duties. Nothing in the bureaucratic documentation suggested anything unusual about the mission. But stories have a way of persisting outside official channels. In the mountain villages near the pass Zhang Wei had crossed, tales began to circulate about the courier who had entered the sacred realm and returned. The details varied with each telling, as stories do, growing more elaborate and dramatic with repetition. Some versions claim Zhang Wei had spoken with immortals and gained mystical knowledge. Others said he had crossed through time and met his own future self. Still others whispered that he had never truly returned at all, that the man who came back from the mountain was not quite the same person who had entered. The station master who had noted Zhang Wei's resemblance to an earlier courier could never quite shake his certainty about that similarity. In his old age, he would tell anyone who would listen about the young man who had looked exactly like someone from 20 years before, how their mannerisms were identical, how even their horses had been the same distinctive color and marking. He speculated that the mountain pass was playing tricks with time, creating loops or echoes that ordinary clocks and calendars couldn't measure. Zhang Wei himself became increasingly reluctant to discuss the experience. When fellow couriers would ask about the pass, seeking advice for their own crossings, he would offer only practical guidance about the physical route, the stations, the terrain. He never mentioned the fog, the glowing beings, the realm between. Perhaps he feared being thought mad. Perhaps he worried that speaking of it would diminish or distort the memory. Or perhaps he understood that some experiences resist translation into words, that attempting to explain would only create confusion rather than clarity. But his behavior changed in subtle ways that those close to him noticed. His wife reported that he seemed more distant at times, as if part of his attention was always elsewhere, focused on something she couldn't see. He developed a habit of standing outside at night, staring at the mountains for hours, regardless of weather or temperature. When asked what he was looking at, he would simply say he was thinking or that he found the mountains beautiful, but his wife sensed there was more to it than that. His daughter, as she grew older, would later recall how her father seemed to exist slightly apart from everyday concerns, how he moved through life with a kind of gentle detachment that made him seem wise but also sad. She remembered him telling her stories about the mountains, tales that mixed practical knowledge with mythological elements in ways that made it impossible to tell where fact ended and imagination began. He would speak of the spirits that lived in high places, of the strange properties of mountain air, of the way time moved differently at certain altitudes. Zhang continued his courier work for several more years after his passage through the mountain. He was promoted, given increasing responsibility, recognized for his reliability and skill. But those who knew him well could see that some fundamental enthusiasm had diminished. He performed his duties perfectly, but without the deep engagement that had characterized his earlier career. It was as if he was going through motions that no longer quite connected to who he had become. Eventually, Zhang requested a transfer to a station master position, giving up the active writing that had been his life. This surprised his superiors, as he was still in his prime, still capable of many more years in the saddle. But he was persuasive in his request, arguing that he could serve the empire better by training and supporting younger couriers, by passing on his accumulated knowledge and experience. The transfer was granted, and Zhang settled into managing a small station on a secondary route, far from the dramatic mountain passes that had defined his most significant experiences. In this new role, Zhang became known for his unusual approach to training courier candidates. He emphasized not just the physical skills and the protocols, but also a kind of awareness that went beyond standard curriculum. He taught young couriers to pay attention to atmosphere, to trust their instincts about places and situations, to recognize when the ordinary rules might not apply. Some of his superiors viewed this teaching as questionable, too focused on superstition and folk belief. But the couriers he trained developed an excellent safety record, somehow managing to avoid the kinds of accidents and mishaps that claimed so many riders in difficult terrain. The pass where Zhang had his transformative experience gained a reputation over the years. Other couriers who crossed it reported strange phenomena, though none quite as dramatic as what Zhang had encountered. Unusual fogs were common. Time disorientation was frequently mentioned. Some riders spoke of hearing music with no visible source, of seeing lights that couldn't be explained, of feeling presences watching from the mountainside. The Imperial authorities, pragmatic as always, responded to these reports by routing most traffic through alternative passes whenever possible. The route through Ghost Wind Gap, as it came to be known, was designated for emergency use only, when speed was absolutely critical and the extra days required a detour around it couldn't be afforded. Couriers assigned to cross it were given special briefings, warned about the psychological effects of isolation and altitude, advised to move quickly and not to let their imaginations run wild. But the real mystery wasn't the pass itself, troubling as its reputation had become. The deeper mystery was what had happened to the courier who had crossed it most completely, who had seen into its true nature and somehow found his way back. Zhang Wei carried that mystery with him for the rest of his life, and it changed him in ways both subtle and profound. In his later years, after he had retired from the postal service entirely, Zhang Wei would occasionally welcome travelers to his home, particularly those with an interest in mountain lore and unexplained phenomena. To these visitors, he would sometimes speak more openly about his experience, though still with a certain reticence, as if the full truth remained too large and strange to articulate completely. One such visitor, a Buddhist monk with an interest in anomalous spiritual experiences, spent several days in conversation with the aging Zhang Wei. The monk later wrote about their discussions, and his account provides one of the most detailed glimpses into Zhang Wei's understanding of what had happened to him. According to the monk's record, Zhang Wei described the mountain not as a physical location so much as a meeting point between different modes of existence. He spoke of realms that coexisted with ordinary reality but operated under different laws, places where consciousness and matter interacted in ways that seemed impossible from a normal perspective. He suggested that certain locations, particularly mountains with specific geological and spiritual characteristics, could serve as gateways to these other realms. Most importantly, Zhang Wei described a choice that he believed confronted every person who encountered such threshold experiences. One could retreat into comfortable denial, dismissing the experience as hallucination or delusion and returning to a purely materialist understanding of the world. One could become obsessed with the experience, spending the rest of one's life trying to return to the otherworldly realm and never quite succeeding. Or one could integrate the experience, allowing it to deepen and complicate one's understanding of reality while still engaging fully with ordinary life. Zhang Wei claimed to have chosen this third path, though he acknowledged it was the most difficult. It required holding contradictory truths simultaneously, accepting that the world was both rational and mysterious, both comprehensible and ultimately unknowable. It meant living with uncertainty, with questions that had no answers, with memories of experiences that could never be fully explained or shared. The monk found Zhang Wei's perspective profound and wrote extensively about their conversations. But even this detailed account left much unexplained. What exactly had Zhang Wei seen in the mountain? How had he navigated the timeless realm? What had become of the glowing beings and the impossible architecture? Zhang Wei's answers to these questions remained elusive, circling around the core mystery without ever quite illuminating it fully. In the final years of his life, Zhang Wei's family noticed him spending increasingly long periods in contemplation, sitting silently for hours at a time. When asked what he was thinking about during these sessions, he would say he was remembering or that he was listening, though for what he was listening he never specified. Zhang Wei died peacefully in his sleep at what was considered a good age for someone who had spent years in the demanding courier service. His funeral was well attended, with former colleagues, family members, and local people who had known him all coming to pay respects. Many spoke of his dedication to duty, his skill as a courier, his effectiveness as a station master, his wisdom as a teacher. But a smaller group, those who had heard his stranger stories and sensed the mystery he carried, spoke of something else. They remembered him as someone who had walked between worlds, who had glimpsed realities beyond ordinary perception, and who had chosen to return and live a normal life despite having been offered something extraordinary. They saw his life not as a failure to pursue the mystical, but as a testament to the courage it took to choose ordinary human connection over supernatural allure. After Zhang Wei's death, his family discovered among his possessions a number of items that seemed at odds with his practical nature. There was the jade charm that Station Master Wu had given him before his fateful crossing, which Zhang Wei had kept all those years despite being someone who generally eschewed such tokens. There was a journal, mostly empty, with only a few pages filled with cryptic notations that looked like attempts to map something that couldn't be mapped, to chart territories that had no fixed coordinates. Most mysteriously, there was a small stone, smooth and ordinary-looking, that nonetheless possessed a strange quality. When held in the hand, it seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below the threshold of normal perception. Zhang Wei's wife said he had brought this stone back from his crossing of Ghost Wind Gap, that he would sometimes hold it when he sat in his long contemplative silences. After his death, she kept the stone for a while, but eventually gave it to the old monk who had documented Zhang Wei's conversations about the other realm. The monk took the stone to his monastery and placed it in their collection of unusual objects, items that were believed to have connections to spiritual experiences or unexplained phenomena. Over the years, several monks reported unusual experiences when meditating near the stone. Some described visions of mountain landscapes unlike any in the normal world. Others spoke of hearing music that seemed to come from vast distances. A few claimed to briefly sense presences, beings of light and intelligence that existed beyond ordinary perception. But none of these secondary experiences matched the intensity or clarity of Zhang Wei's original encounter. It was as if the stone held only an echo of what Zhang Wei had experienced, a faint resonance of the realm between that he had traversed. The pass itself, Ghost Wind Gap, remains in use to this day, though its reputation has never entirely dissipated. Modern travelers with GPS devices and satellite phones report malfunctions in the area. Hikers describe disorientation, lost time, the sense of being watched. The rational explanations cite magnetic anomalies, unusual acoustic properties, oxygen deprivation at altitude. But those who know the old stories recognize the pattern and treat the past with a respect due to a place that exists at the boundary between different orders of reality. Zhang Wei's story has become part of the local folklore, one of many tales about travelers who encountered strangeness in the mountains and were changed by it. Some versions of the story claim he never really returned, that his family was deceived by a replica or a spirit taking his form. Others suggest he gained the ability to move between worlds at will and would secretly return to the realm between throughout his life. Still others hold that his choice to return to ordinary life was itself a kind of magic, a more profound transformation than staying in the otherworldly realm would have been. The truth, if such a thing can be determined about events so strange and subjective, probably lies somewhere between all these interpretations. Zhang Wei crossed a mountain pass and encountered something that defied explanation. He made choices that allowed him to return to his life. He carried the memory and the mystery of that experience through his remaining years. And in the end, he left behind not answers, but a deeper questioning, an invitation to consider that the world might be larger and stranger than our everyday experience suggests. For those who work in the courier service today, even in its modernized form with vehicles instead of horses and electronic communication supplementing physical documents, Zhang Wei's story serves as a reminder of the earlier era when individual couriers were the lifelines of empire. But for a smaller group, those inclined toward mystery and philosophical speculation. His story serves a different purpose. It suggests that in pursuing our duties and navigating our paths through life, we might occasionally brush against realms of experience that transcend the mundane, and that how we respond to such encounters matters more than we might imagine. The mountain remains, as mountains do, patient and enduring. The pass continues to serve as a route through difficult terrain, away from one side to the other. Most who cross it experience nothing more unusual than the normal challenges of high-altitude travel. But the possibility remains, subtle and unspoken, that under certain conditions, when the atmosphere aligns just right, when a traveler carries the right kind of purpose or openness, the mountain might reveal its other nature, might open a door to the realm between. And if such a thing were to happen, the example of Zhang provides a template, not a set of instructions, but a way of thinking about the choice. When confronted with the extraordinary, when offered transformation or escape or power, the path that leads back to ordinary life, to family and duty and human connection, might be the most courageous choice of all. As we emerge from Zhang Wei's story, like travelers stepping out of a mountain pass into clear air, we find ourselves in that liminal space between sleep and waking, between the mythic and the mundane. The tale we followed tonight touches on something that goes beyond mere entertainment or historical curiosity. It speaks to fundamental questions about duty, reality, choice, and the nature of the world we inhabit. Zhang Wei was, in most respects, an ordinary man. He wasn't born to greatness. He possessed no special powers or extraordinary gifts. What he had was dedication, a commitment to completing his assigned tasks regardless of difficulty or danger. This quality, so simple on its surface, carried him through his courier career and ultimately led him to the threshold of an experience that transcended ordinary life. The mountain he encountered, whether we interpret it as a literal otherworldly realm or as a profound psychological or spiritual state, presented him with fundamental choices about identity and purpose. He could turn back, preserving his life as it was, but abandoning his mission. He could push forward through time, completing his task, but losing connection to everyone he loved. He could transform into something beyond human, gaining knowledge and power, but leaving humanity behind. Or he could navigate by intuition, trusting his purpose to guide him through the impossible. His choice to follow duty, to maintain his commitment to delivering the dispatch despite the strangeness surrounding him, represents something profound about human character. In a situation where all the rational calculations suggested abandoning the mission, where no one would have blamed him for turning back, Zhang Wei held to his oath. Not from rigid thinking or inability to adapt, but from a deep understanding that our commitments define us, that the reliability we offer to others forms the foundation of trust and community. But equally important was his refusal of the otherworldly path, the offer to become something more than human, to gain immortality and wisdom, to serve in the eternal maintenance of the realm. Between these were genuine temptations, not trickery or deception. Zhang Wei could have accepted that path legitimately. Many in his situation might have done so, but he chose instead to return to the ordinary world, to his family, to his human limitations and mortality. This choice suggests that there is value in the mundane, in the brief and temporary nature of human life that transcends even eternal wisdom or cosmic understanding. The love of family, the satisfaction of completing an ordinary task, well, the simple pleasures of existing within time and limitation. These might be worth more than we typically acknowledge. Zhang Wei's story also reminds us of the vast strangeness that might lie just beyond the boundaries of our normal perception. We live our lives mostly within familiar patterns, seeing the world through lenses shaped by culture and habit. But occasionally, something breaks through, some experience or encounter that doesn't fit our models, that suggests reality is larger and more complex than we usually imagine. How we respond to such experiences, whether they come as dramatic encounters like Zhang Wei's or as subtler moments of wonder or mystery in our own lives, shapes who we become. We can dismiss them, explain them away, file them under hallucination or coincidence. We can become obsessed with them, spending our energy trying to recapture or recreate the moment of strangeness. Or we can integrate them, allowing them to deepen our sense of possibility while still engaging fully with ordinary life. The integration path, which Zhang Wei seemed to follow in his later years, is perhaps the most challenging. It requires holding space for mystery without becoming consumed by it, acknowledging the limits of our understanding without collapsing into either dogmatic certainty or nihilistic meaninglessness. It means living with questions that have no final answers, with experiences that resist explanation, with the awareness that we might be surrounded by dimensions of reality we only glimpse occasionally. As you drift toward sleep now, let Zhang Wei's story accompany you into dreams. Let it raise questions rather than providing answers. Consider the mountains in your own life, the challenges and thresholds that you face, the choices between the known and unknown, between duty and desire, between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Consider, too, the messages you carry, the responsibilities you've accepted, the commitments that define your path through the world. When circumstances become difficult or strange, when a way forward isn't clear, what keeps you moving? What serves as your compass through uncertainty? And perhaps most importantly, consider what you would do if confronted with Zhang Wei's choice, if offered transformation at the cost of everything familiar, knowledge at the price of connection. Would you have the courage to turn down immortality in favor of the brief, precious span of ordinary human life? Would you have the wisdom to choose love and duty over power and enlightenment? These are not questions that demand immediate answers. They're meant to percolate, to settle into the depths of consciousness, to become part of the rich soil from which understanding slowly grows. The mountains remain patient and enduring, holding their mysteries as they have for millennia. The couriers are mostly gone now, replaced by faster and more efficient means of communication. But the fundamental human experiences that Zhang Wei's story captures, duty, choice, wonder, the encounter with the inexplicable, these remain constant across all eras and cultures. So sleep well, dear listeners, wrapped in the mystery of what might lie just beyond the boundaries of the known. Let the story of Zhang Wei and his impossible journey remind you that the world is deeper than surfaces suggest, that purpose can guide us through the strangest territories, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies not in embracing the extraordinary, but in choosing to return to the ordinary, to the people and places and duties that give our brief human lives their meaning. Tonight, thank you for joining me on this journey from the ancient mountains of China, through the mysterious realms between reality and mystery, and from a man's devotion to his duty to his heart. This is Mysterious Sleep Stories, where history and mystery meet the borderlands, where documented past meets whispered legends that have survived through generations. We hope this story has given you time to reflect as you drift off to sleep. That Zhang Wei's journey has reminded you of the profound mysteries that may exist just beyond our ordinary perceptions, waiting to be discovered by those who stray far enough from familiar paths. If you enjoyed tonight's story, we would be very grateful if you subscribe to our channel. Your subscription helps us continue to create these long-lasting, atmospheric stories that blend historical research with mythological possibilities, honoring both truth and imagination equally. And please, turn on your notifications so you never miss a new broadcast. We have many more stories waiting to be told, many more journeys into the mysterious past and the borderlands where reality blurs. We also love hearing feedback from our listeners. Please take a moment to leave a comment indicating where you're listening from and where in the world you are. There's something beautiful about these stories reaching people in different countries, time periods, and cultures, uniting us all in our curiosity about the mysteries of history. And if you have specific topics, legends, historical periods, or types of mysteries you'd like us to explore in future episodes, please share your ideas in the comments. Your suggestions guide our research and help us create content that interests you most. Whether it's stories from ancient China, legends from different cultures, historical mysteries, or the unexplained, we want to hear what captures your imagination. Perhaps you have your own stories, experiences that don't quite fit into ordinary categories, moments when you encountered something strange or inexplicable. We can't explore every narrative, but we love reading about these personal experiences. They remind us that the boundary regions between the known and the unknown are not merely historical or mythological, but also part of the ongoing human experience, still accessible to those open to curiosity. As you drift off to sleep, allow the story to settle into your subconscious. Let it blend into your dreams. Perhaps you will find yourself walking mountain paths, encountering your own version of the in-between realm, making your own choices about task and transformation. Dreams have always been humanity's way of processing the mysterious, of grappling with questions too vast for waking consciousness to encompass. And when you awaken, whether it's tomorrow morning or after a brief rest tonight, you will return to the ordinary world with all its demands and routines. But perhaps you will carry something from Zhang Wei's journey with you. Perhaps you will look at the mountains a little differently, or think about task and choice in new ways, or simply make room for the possibility that reality might be stranger and more wonderful than everyday experiences suggest. Thank you again for spending this time with us. Thank you for your attention, your curiosity, your willingness to journey into the unknown with us. Until our next story, the next exploration of mystery and history, sleep well, dream deeply, and remember that the world is vast and full of wonders waiting to be discovered. Good night to everyone from Mystic Sleep Tales, and may your dreams be filled with mountains and mysteries, courage and wonder, and all the beauty that exists in the borderlands where the known meets the unknown. Remember that tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life.